So I'm going to talk from the perspective of being a research associate on the In Place of War project. The In Place of War project is a research project that's still going. It started in 2004, housed in the drama department, funded by the HRC and latterly by the Hughes Trust. And it looks to research and document theatre practices in places of conflict. So a lot of the project has involved myself and other researchers, Alison you're going to hear from today, going to places of conflict and learning from artists, theatre artists, what they're doing in those zones and how theatre can be, what kinds of functions theatre can have in places of disaster and extraordinary suffering. I'm not going to say more about the project than that. There's a website that you can look at called inplaceofwar.net if you want to find out more about that. But what I want to do is speak about how some of the really tricky issues from that project speaks to the University of Manchester's social responsibility agenda, which is goal 3 of our university here in Manchester. I just thought I'd start by reading out goal 3. Okay, so here we go. Goal 3, the social responsibility agenda of the university is to make the university a force for good, locally, nationally and internationally, by bringing knowledge to bear on the great issues facing the world in the 21st century, and by producing graduates prepared to exercise social leadership and environmental responsibility. So that's the starting point. I want to just raise some questions, really, that came out of the In Place of War project that speaks to some of the key phrases in that term. Okay, so it might be a bit annoying, because I'm going to ask lots of questions and not give you many answers, but we can unpick some things in the discussion afterwards. So the first set of questions relate to the idea of research being a force for good. Okay, so the first one the question I want to ask is, what local and hidden tensions does our research in places of war, places elsewhere, engage in, exacerbate, heighten, legitimise or disrupt? And how can we navigate those hidden and local tensions when often they're beyond our awareness when we're making research visits to places? Second question, how can we develop and sustain collaborative research partnerships? We wanted to work with artists in place of war to explore their work and to develop and document new understandings. How can we facilitate collaborative research partnerships when the artists and the communities in places of conflict that we're working with, our relative situations are configured by stark differences in access to resource, social and economic opportunities and security, social, economic, political security. We've got freedom to travel, get research monies, publish, critique. How possible is collaborative research when your research partner doesn't have those freedoms, those basic freedoms to research? What we've discovered on the project is the apparently simple decisions we make about which theatre groups to talk to, and even in which order to talk to them in places of conflict, were very important. Those decisions had a ripple effect that rippled across microsystems of power in places of conflict that were very difficult for outsider researchers to read, to be aware of, until much latterly often, especially in the context of short-term visits to extract data, which was my role in the project. I was the research associate on the project, doing a kind of mapping job of trying to discover how theatre was being used in very different places of conflict. So how possible is it for us to successfully navigate the power dynamics of localities configured by conflict when those localities are unknown to us? Thirdly, under this heading, how do we respond to pleas for help from our partners when they're subject to ongoing disasters, ongoing conflict, their lives continue to be affected by war and suffering? And sometimes we've used the international profile of the project for a force for good here. There was an artist threatened by an extremist group in Sri Lanka, for example, a group that was thought to have some links to some sections of the government, and we were able to use the international profile of the project along with other artists internationally to form a kind of protective blanket that kept him, helped to keep him safe from harm at that time. But more recently we've had a request for help from a theatre group in the occupied Palestinian territories following the assassination of a theatre director there, and reportedly, the threat to the company is coming from because of the presence of international researchers and international volunteers in that theatre group, and where the sort of conservative culture that the theatre organisation is situated within don't like the presence of Western influences on the young people from their community. To respond to a plea to help there would obviously, especially to publicly respond, would obviously do more harm, risk doing extraordinary levels of harm. Moving on, forcing good or a force for good is a phrase that sort of we came back to. I'm looking at James was the PI on this project. I'm just looking at James, you might have to chip in the discussion. And I'm remembering a drama workshop with ex-child soldiers in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which ended with the young people turning to us and indicating that they were hungry and they needed money for food. So why research drama and theatre in these contexts when there are basic social and economic needs not being met? And there are clearly bigger questions about the ethics and the politics of how and why research gets funded. For us, with the In Place of War project, on the one hand, we were receiving money from a UK government that was conducting sometimes, perhaps, arguably illegitimate wars in different places of the world, and on the other hand, giving theatre researchers, the drama department, significant amounts of money to research cultural interventions in those zones. And I want to suggest that those two branches of activity aren't opposite. They're part of the same very complex economic, global networks of how research gets funded and how knowledge is made and transferred around the world. And we became very interested in this idea of soft power, of the arts being used to sort of make interventions in different contexts as a form of soft power that was sort of a partner of the more militaristic forms of power. Anyway, so my point there really is, how do we maintain a critical stance when we're embedded in those kinds of networks? And what sort of critical stance is needed? Are there different kind of critical responses that are needed at different points in a project? So, for example, what happens when a research partner is refused a visa to visit the UK when your very project is based on your numerous visits to Sri Lanka, in this case, that have happened without any blocks from sort of immigration or international visiting? You're kidding. Okay. To turn to the phrase bringing knowledge to bear on the great issues facing the world in the 21st century, I think one of the problem that we had with this is many of the theatre projects we encountered described themselves in familiar and comfortable terms: peace, reconciliation, rights, but on closer examination were configured by an aesthetics and politics that were more problematic. So how do we, as knowledge sharers, makers, provide platforms that offer critique but don't perhaps threaten the livelihood of artists that are our collaborative partners, and also accept the terms by which they understand their work but create a useful critical debate inside them? And I'm thinking about the possibility of private forums for sharing knowledge as well as public forums. Just very briefly, two questions inspired by the idea of research exercising social leadership and environmental responsibility. Alison and I now have both got proper jobs as lecturers in the Department of Drama. What happens to our research partners when our time is taken up by the weighty demands of being full-time lecturers, where we can no longer divert so much time to research? What happens to our partners then? And secondly, the carbon footprint left by this project was significant. There was a lot of international travel. How can we maintain the important international dimensions of our research without adding to environmental problems?